So I'm gonna make a quick video about these flutes, the Irish flute. Those are the flutes I play, made by Thierry Denis, a French guy from Alsace. I'm just making this video to give everybody a little bit of basic information about these instruments, and particularly to those who are thinking about starting to learn the Irish flute or potentially buying one of these flutes, because I get constantly asked at workshops and concerts, etc. So very quick, brief rundown. This is the Irish flute, and it's more or less derived from the old classical Baroque flutes. Back in the days when they were made of wood as well, the Irish and others, of course, as well, continued to make these wooden flutes and kept developing them, and they eventually turned into what's now known as the Irish flute. They're made of African blackwood, generally, although a lot of makers are offering different woods now for environmental reasons, but it's the hardness of this wood in particular that gives the Irish flute its sound, because the density of the wood kind of gives a lot of the resonance and the overtones. Then the Irish flute is based on the root note D, so you have 6 fingering holes, and they play essentially a D major scale. That also, by the way, explains some of the weird keys that we play in Irish music most predominantly, such as E Dorian, A Mixolydian. So if you were to play A major on these holes, you'd play A major with a G essentially, which makes it Mixolydian. Same if you play E minor with a C sharp, it becomes E Dorian. You don't necessarily need keys. You can play 90+% of the Irish repertoire with a keyless flute. The keys are really there for when you want to play some of the tunes that are in G minor or D minor, or also for ornamentation, or to play other types of music as well, other than Irish music. So this is, for example, a keyed flute. It's got 6 keys, making it fully chromatic. But fully chromatic with Irish flutes doesn't mean the same thing as it does in classical instruments. Classical instruments are made to be as playable in any key, essentially. The Irish flute will always remain most playable in the keys related to D. Yeah, I'll tell you a bit more about the keys in a bit. The next thing to know about the Irish flute is there are 2 models essentially that these flutes are built on, and one of them is called the Pratten model, and the other is called Ruddle and Rose. Those were makers of flutes back in the days. The flutes we play today, of course, are far evolved in many terms, especially intonation, etc. Most flute makers, as far as I'm concerned, specialize in building Irish flutes based on the Pratten model or the Ruddle and Rose model. Many makers make both, but in my experience, they usually focus on one of those models. If you see an Irish flute that is divided in 3 main pieces, like this one, then that's a Pratten model flute. If this middle part is split again into 2 pieces, so you'll usually see a ring here, then that indicates it's a Ruddle and Rose model. So 4-piece flute essentially is a Ruddle and Rose model, and the 3-piece is a Pratten model. I'm neglecting the fact that obviously the tuning slide is detachable as well, but not all flutes have a tuning slide, for example, and that doesn't relate to the build model necessarily. So what model is the right one for you, Pratten or Ruddle and Rose? I can't tell you what is, because they're both great, they're just different. I'll try and explain to you a little bit in my experience what the differences are, and maybe that gives you a bit of an indication. So Pratten models, these ones, they're both Pratten, have a strong tone. They can be louder than Ruddle and Rose flutes. Everything I say, by the way, is not a must. It's just general guidance, and there'll be examples of the country, of course. Generally, Pratten models are said to be a bit louder, especially in the lower notes. So the lower octave is a little bit richer in tone and can be more powerful. At the same time, they're said to be, let's say, heavier to play, particularly in the higher octave. So that can maybe mean a little less agility. And the other thing about Pratten flutes is that they're less well balanced. So all the way from the lowest to the highest note, the sound will vary more between the tonal range and the way it's played. Yeah, so your embouchure, the technique you'll need to use to get the most out of it, has a greater variety. How you play the flute across the entire range. So on the other hand, Ruddle and Rose are said to be more balanced, sound more balanced, playability more balanced, intonation potentially more balanced across the tonal range from the lowest to the highest note. That can mean that, for example, your embouchure remains more stable across the tonal range. Another thing that people commonly say is that Ruddle and Rose has a bit of an advantage in terms of agility and brilliance, and especially the sound in the higher octaves. And Prattens are said to be a bit more powerful, have richer lower octave, but are a little bit heavier to play. For me personally, I like Pratten models for no very logical reason. I just like the way they feel. I feel like a Pratten flute can be pushed a little bit, whereas a Ruddle and Rose has a narrower operating window. That's something I like. However, and that's a good transition to this flute, I've only just gotten this very recently and I'm still getting used to it. But this is a Pratten flute that, in my opinion, is closer to a Ruddle, to the characteristics of a Ruddle and Rose flute. It's more well balanced. The second octave is gorgeous. The sound in the higher octave is beautiful. It has a very brilliant tone there. For example, the lower octave on this is stronger, and this one can be pushed a little bit more, which I like. What do I mean by pushing? So you can draw more power from it when you want to, whereas this one sounds a little bit more stable. You can get much more power from this without pushing. So it's made to kind of give off a lot of sound without you having to push. I'll play you a slower little piece on both, and you can get an idea of what they sound like. Same thing on this one. You don't necessarily need keys. In fact, a lot of great flute players don't use keys. One of my favorites being Eamon de Barra. I mean, generally just listen to him if you can. One of my favorite flute players, among many. There's so many that can't name them all. But just as an example for somebody who doesn't play a keyed flute, some notes can be played by half holding them. If you do get a keyed flute, then you can choose how many keys or which keys you want. So I've got one with 6 keys, so it's fully chromatic. Chromatic with an Irish flute is not the same chromatic as a classical instrument. While you have every note on the scale, every semitone, and it's always gonna be most playable, most suited to the keys related to D. But the keys are very useful for the odd accidental note in a tune. It can be useful for playing other styles of music as well. How many keys do you need and which ones? The first 2 you're going to need the most is a G sharp and an F natural. Now this key has 2 F naturals, a long F natural and a short F natural. If the melody is moving upwards or downwards, it can be easier to use a short F natural key or a long F natural key. Yeah, so this flute is lacking the lower C and C sharp keys, which would be these 2 keys. I think this is a good solution for having a chromatic instrument that's not too heavy on the bottom end, because these 2 keys are quite heavy, and of course they're at the very end of the flute. Now the other thing people keep asking me about is the ornamentation on these flutes that Thierry makes, which is pretty spectacular. I've known him for a long time, and I know he doesn't necessarily do it because it's flashy or people are going to buy his instruments because of it. I think he just enjoys the art of making them. It's pretty beautiful stuff. So that's all hand engraved ornamentation. The keys are handmade. Yeah, so it's pretty beautiful work. There's different ornaments. I like these leaves as well. There's the leaves on like a textured background, and then there's the leaves just purely the leaves, which I like as well. Yeah. So what prices do you have to kind of expect or reckon with if you're looking for an Irish flute? As always, there's everything from super cheap to super expensive, but as a general rule, you'll be looking at about €600 to €700 upwards for a keyless flute like this, which I think is pretty good value for a handmade instrument that sounds amazing, and you can play 90% of all the tunes you'll be wanting to play. And I've literally played this keyless flute for the last 7 years. I'd previously played a keyed flute, and I didn't necessarily miss the keys so much. I'm happy to have one with keys again now, but really it's more for playing around and ornamentation. For a flute like this, the keys are really what make the flute expensive, so it's also the part that you can kind of save on if that's not super important to you. A flute like this with 6 keys, it's hard to tell because the prices vary massively where the flute maker is, etc. But as a general rule, I think you can kind of expect anything from 2 to 2,500 euro upwards. Yeah, and I mean upwards. So it goes really upwards. Yeah, so I'll play one reel for you to give you an idea of what they sound like when you play something a bit faster. And by comparison, I'll be putting a couple of links in the description if you want to look at other stuff. And yeah, enjoy your flute playing.